morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to my brand new F1 2024 video series. So with the first two races of the season underway, you F1 fans might have a hard time navigating the Grand Prix. This video is here to give you the basic context and analysis that you need to enjoy the rest of the season. So without further ado, let's get right into it. Starting off with a recap of the 2023 season. Max Verstappen won the championship again for the third year in a row with a record of 575 points, winning a staggering 19 out of the 22 races. His teammate Sergio Perez won the remaining 2 out of 3 races, and total Red Bull won a total of 21 out of the 22 races, cementing the RB19 as one of the best and arguably the best Formula One car of all time. Arguably the best. No disrespect to anyone else. Other teams on the grid went through different types of evolution throughout the season. Starting off with Aston Martin. Aston Martin showed promising results in the beginning of the year, but after changing their car a little bit, they started to decline in performance. However, McLaren had an opposite trend and worked their way up throughout the year and eventually reached consistent podiums, with their new rookie Oscar Piastri even winning a sprint race. Meanwhile, F1's very own American racer at Williams, Logan Sargent, scored a singular point this year at the American Grand Prix.
God bless our troops! God bless America! And gentlemen!
I like it. I like it. Let me get more. Facts! That's what I'm talking about! That's why he's doing this! That's why he's the GOAT! The GOAT!
Mid to late season, Sergio Perez and Lewis Hamilton battled it out for P2, in which Perez eventually ended up prevailing. The season ended with the Constructors' Championship looking like the following. So, moving on to the off-season. Usually drivers take about a month, maybe 2 months to relax and vacation with family and friends during the off-season, and then it's back to training. Meanwhile, teams test out the new cars for the next season and change it up a little bit if need be. This offseason, we got some interesting bits of news. The first being that Lewis Hamilton, who has been with Mercedes and won 6 world championships for them over the course of a decade, is giving up his seat in 2025 and moving to Ferrari. Now, as a lifelong Mercedes fan myself, I may or may not have thrown up for an hour after hearing this news. There's no proof, we'll never know. However, after further analysis of the situation, it's actually a win-win for everybody, besides maybe Mercedes.
Die Menschen, die überall und nirgends zu Hause sind, die nirgends einen Boden haben.
Lewis Hamilton, already winning 7 world championships, now has a new and real opportunity to win more world championships and cement himself as the consensus GOAT of F1. Meanwhile, Ferrari has a chance to put themselves back on the winning column, winning another championship since 2007 and maybe dethroning the Red Bull reign. Now, while Hamilton joining Ferrari might pose problems to Charles Leclerc in terms of his championship dreams, it does give him a new teammate to work with, and their styles complement each other very well. Now, Mercedes will probably take a huge hit from this, but it gives them a chance to move in a new direction and establish themselves as a reputable team again. Now, besides the fact that the biggest name in F1 and the biggest team in F1 are going to be joining forces in 2025. What does this highlight? Why is this important? Well, it highlights the switch in strategies that teams are going to start using to dethrone Red Bull. Teams go one of two ways with their drivers. Either they have a primary driver and a secondary driver. The primary driver does the offense, while the secondary driver plays defense and gives them time during pit stops and allows them to win the race and win more points. The second strat is having two offensive drivers who both compete with each other but also complement each other in terms of style and skill and allow them to beat other teams together and both score points and both win races. Now, this shows that Ferrari is going from the primary and secondary driver strat to the double offensive driver strat. They're reverting back to 2007 when they had Kimi Räikkönen and Felipe Massa. If you want to go further back as an example, to look at examples of the double offensive driver strat, you can look at the 1970s and McLaren with Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna, two legends of the game. But more recently, and the most famous example of this would be Mercedes in their Hamilton and Rosberg era that ruled the 2010s. Eventually, Nico Rosberg left Mercedes and retired, which allowed Mercedes to switch to the primary and secondary driver strat, using Valtteri Bottas as a defensive driver to Hamilton. Now, Red Bull decided to mirror this strat after 2020 and use Sergio Perez as the defensive driver and Max Verstappen as the offensive driver to win their own championship and establish their own era of dominance. Now, like I mentioned before, McLaren has always leaned towards the two offensive driver strat, and they've been nurturing their own perfect team since 2016, and they really seem to have found their flow in 2023 with the signing of their new rookie Oscar Piastri working in conjunction with Lando Norris. Mercedes will probably also recognize the need to change strategies and will have to sign someone who can equal and complement George Russell's skill. That being said, here are my top contenders for the Mercedes 2025 seat, ranked in order. Number 1, Logan Sargent.
Stop the cap!
Just kidding. He needs to worry about that Williams seat. Score more points for us, buddy. Number 1 for real, Kimi Antonelli. Currently an F2 driver, he's very talented at 17 years old, and his style is often compared to young Hamilton or young Rosberg. Now, it might be too early to say all that. Let him drive an F1 car at least. But nonetheless, he is very talented. And if he wins the F2 championship this year, or even gets a podium place, his Mercedes seat is basically guaranteed. Number 2, Mick Schumacher. Mick Schumacher is currently the reserve driver for Mercedes, but it seems that they're not very interested in actually signing him, but he might be their only real choice. And although his rookie year at Haas was pretty underwhelming, he did pretty well considering he was in the worst car on the grid, on the worst team in the grid. Number 3, Carlos Sainz. Now, while Sainz does seem to be an obvious number 1 choice, considering he's coming right out of Ferrari and he has an open seat, his untapped potential doesn't make up for his history of being a difficult teammate to work with, and coupling him with the already aggressive and ambitious George Russell would be a recipe for disaster, a ticking time bomb just waiting to go off. Last and certainly not least, Fernando Alonso. Now, rumors of Mercedes being involved in Alonso have been around for ages. However, the reason I ranked Alonso so low is because he himself expressed his own content at staying at Aston Martin, and honestly, he hasn't looked this happy since his Renault days back in the 2000s, which is saying a lot. Now, as you can imagine, Carlos Sainz isn't too happy about losing his seat, and his fans are even more outraged. Now, let me explain something. Although Carlos Sainz was the only non-Red Bull racer to win a race in 2023, that does not make him a better investment or even as good of an investment as Charles Leclerc. Carlos Sainz excels in understeer cars and overall is less consistent than Leclerc in terms of less overall wins, less podiums, less points in 2023, and historically, like I mentioned before, has been a difficult driver to work with. Pause a second. Let's back up a little bit. I mentioned understeer cars. I will be explaining the difference between understeer and oversteer cars and other intricacies about Formula One cars and things of that nature in my Formula One crash course video, which is coming out soon. In a couple weeks, probably a couple months, by 2025. 26 probably. We'll see. Moving on. What should Carlos Sainz do now? Well, obviously he needs to do well in 2024, not only as a driver, but also as a teammate. He needs to sell himself to whatever team would be interested in signing him in 2025. There's a chance that a Red Bull seat might open up for him if Sergio Perez doesn't do well this year and Red Bull decides to let him go. But more likely he needs to look at smaller teams on the F1 grid, or maybe being a reserve driver. He could look at RB, Sauber, Haas. I wouldn't recommend Haas, but it's an option nonetheless.
Introduce you to the right now. Oh my God.
Or throughout the season, he needs to keep his eyes on the Audi F1 team that will be entering the F1 grid in 2026. Another video about that will be coming out, discussing the future of F1. Stay tuned. Okay, let's review the first two races of the season. First race, Bahrain Grand Prix. Now, usually the opening season is interesting. The opening race is interesting, as you can see the different cars and whatnot. It was a bit underwhelming this year. The podium went as the following: Max Verstappen, Sergio Perez, and George Russell. Now, Charles Leclerc qualified P2 and was expected to give Max Verstappen a lot of competition, but he faced extreme braking issues with the car during the race and thus only reached P4. However, still very impressive considering how bad the braking issues were. Meanwhile, Mercedes, McLaren, RB, and Aston Martin all faced problems with pace, despite showing promising cars in testing and practice. And yet, overall, the race was somewhat boring just because a lot of the cars that were expected to show promising results faced technical issues. Now, the second race, the Jeddah Grand Prix, was a bit more exciting, with the podium being Max Verstappen, Perez, and Charles Leclerc. Pierre Gasly from Alpine retired in lap 1 due to a gearbox issue, which just shows that Alpine is probably the worst car on the grid right now, and it has to work really hard to even score a point this year. Lap 7, Lance Stroll DNF'd on the penultimate turn, and a safety car was deployed. Kevin Magnussen at Haas was given a 20-second penalty and used it to hold the group up for Nico Hülkenberg's advantage, his teammate, and this allowed Haas to actually score points in the second race. The highlight of the race, though, was the fact that Carlos Sainz was not able to race due to needing surgery for his appendix, and he was replaced by F2 driver and reserve driver Ollie Behrman. Ollie Behrman did really well considering that he had never driven an F1 car before and didn't really get any practice with it. He started off at P11 and worked his way up into points at P7. Now, this is where the exciting part of the race was. Lewis Hamilton, Ollie Behrman, and Lando Norris, along with his teammate Oscar Piastri, battled it out at P7 Piastri ended up making it through, and Behrman barely escaped Lewis Hamilton. Overall, decently exciting race, and the Australian Grand Prix will be happening March 24th. I will be doing a video covering the Australian Grand Prix and the rest of the races throughout the year. If you enjoyed this video, thank you for watching, and I hope it helped. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe, and tune in for the rest of my F1 series.